Hi, 7th and 8th grade. Happy Wednesday. It is May 20th, and you just have like 2 more days of video lessons, and you are done the school year. So that is something to celebrate. Hang in there. We're wrapping up this nutrition unit. And if you look at this picture, maybe you know what we're talking about today. If you guessed fats or lipids, you would be right, because that is what we're focusing on. So today we're going to talk about the third and final macronutrient. We talked about carbohydrates, we've talked about protein now, so now we're going to talk about lipids, which are fats. So lipids are also organic molecules, and they are composed of the fats and the oils. Fat is essential to your health because fat helps you store energy. It composes the cell membrane of every single cell in your body. So remember, everything in your body is made up of a cell, because cells make up tissues and tissues make up organs and so on and so forth. So every cell has to have fat. So it is essential. It also is involved in growth and repair in your body and your brain health, because believe it or not, most of your brain is actually made up of fat. And fat, unfortunately, gets a really bad rap in today's society. But things are slowly changing a little bit on that. And again, as I said in the previous video, and as I've reiterated all year, science is always changing. Science is never a definite. Science evolves, we find new things, we realize things that we previously thought were wrong, and that's kind of the case with fat. Years ago in the 70s and 80s and 90s, fat was kind of the big taboo thing in culture. A lot of people looked at one study that was done. Turns out it was a quite flawed study in terms of how it was conducted. So the scientific method was employed, but things were not done in a way to control the experiment to give true results. And that one study shaped much of what the government, even today, still uses for their guidelines, unfortunately. And there's a lot of people who are out there trying to fight for change in this area, because as a whole, most of us have been led to believe that fat is the enemy, and that is not necessarily true. Fat is actually so vital and important, and eating fat does not make you get fat. So that's, if you learn nothing else from this video, that is what I want you to learn, is that eating a bunch of fat is not going to make you fat. It matters the quality of fat that you're eating, and it also matters how much sugar and carbohydrates you're eating alongside the fat. And for obvious reasons, it also matters how physically active you are and how you live your life. But just eating fat alone does not make you fat. And if you don't believe me, most of you by now know that I only eat meat right now because that's what my disease can handle, but I eat an immense amount of fat. Like, if I piled up how much fat I eat, you'd be like, that's disgusting, that's a ton of fat. And it's true, I eat a lot of fat, but if you've noticed, I'm not the size of a house. Okay, I'm like 105 pounds soaking wet. So, eating a ton of fat does not actually make you fat. There's a lot of things that go into play here. Eating a lot of fat and sugar together will make you fat, but fat alone will not make you fat. Remember nothing. If you remember nothing else, that is what I want you to remember. All right, so let's talk about why fat is so important and why eating fat does not necessarily make us fat. Fats and oils both make up the lipids, and fats are those that are solid at room temperature. Think butter. You can put a stick of butter out on the counter and it will get soft, but it's still a solid shape, right? Whereas oils are those that are liquids at room temperature, like olive oil and avocado oil and such. So that's the distinction between a fat and an oil, is what form is it in when it's at room temperature. And now remember, as we've talked about these calculations, fats and oils provide more than twice the amount of energy than protein and carbs, because remember, 1 gram of fat is 9 calories of energy versus 1 gram of protein and carbs is only 4, so more than twice as much. And so that makes them a really good storage compound for energy for our bodies to use at a later time, because it stores a lot more calories than carbs and protein. And we can classify lipids, so both fats and oils, as either simple or compound. And the most common simple lipid is called a triglyceride, which you may have heard before. When you get blood work, if they're checking your fat levels and your cholesterol levels and such, they often check for your triglyceride levels. Okay, and so triglycerides are simple lipids that contain one molecule of an alcohol that's called glycerol, so one glycerol molecule, and 3 molecules of a fatty acid. So that's why it's called triglycerides, because there's 3 fatty acids to one glycerol. Okay, and so this is what glycerol looks like, and this is what a free fatty acid looks like, and they come together in this chemical structure to form a triglyceride. And so each fatty acid within that triglyceride, if you think back to that chain, contains carbon and hydrogen atoms. Okay, so lots of carbon and lots of hydrogen. And remember, anything that contains carbon is an organic compound or a substance. And so that's why we said lipids are an organic molecule, because they contain carbon. And so these fatty acids can be one of 2 things. They can either be saturated or unsaturated. And you've heard those terms before. You've seen them on a nutrition facts label. You've heard of saturated fats and unsaturated fats and such. Well, what does that exactly mean? So a saturated fat contains all the hydrogen atoms it can possibly hold, meaning it's saturated. There's no more room in the end, okay? And this form of fat, saturated fat, typically comes a lot from animal sources of food, okay? Whereas unsaturated means that the fatty acids that make up the triglyceride do not contain all the possible hydrogen atoms it can hold. Therefore, there is room at the end. So there could be more hydrogen atoms that go onto that molecule, but there aren't. And so we get an unsaturated, or there is room, okay? And this comes from a lot of plant sources of food. And also trans fats, if you've heard of trans fats, they're classified as an unsaturated fat. Okay, so then what's a trans fat? Trans fats get a really bad rep, and for good reason, but also not good reason, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Trans fats can be either naturally occurring, or they can be artificially or industrial, meaning that they're created kind of in a lab or in a factory type sense for a specific purpose. A moderate intake, so a fair amount of trans fats that comes from naturally occurring foods, is helpful. We need a little bit of trans fats. They're good for us if they come from a natural source. Where do you get that? Well, dairy products and ruminant animals. So what I mean by ruminant animals is things like cattle or cow, sheep and goats. Those are the ruminant animals. And any dairy or meat product that comes from them is going to have a small, moderate amount of naturally occurring trans fats, which are healthful to your body. However, intake of the artificial or the industrial trans fats are very hazardous to our health, and this is widely accepted. This is not really one of those nutrition things that's kind of up for debate, which many nutrition facts are. But universally, most people accept that artificial trans fats are very hazardous to our health. And these occur when a company or a factory that's producing a food product takes vegetable oils and alters them in a lab so that they are not liquid at room temperature anymore. Remember, we said oils are liquid at room temperature? So they take those oils and they alter them so that they're solid at room temperature. And this is used often to increase the shelf life of a product. By changing the structure of the fat, it actually prevents it from getting rancid or going bad as quickly. And so naturally, what types of foods do you find artificial trans fats in? Processed junk food. the kind of food that's shelf stable for way longer than it should be, like Twinkies and stuff like that. Like those things would survive a zombie apocalypse because they have so many preservatives and junk food in them, and likely artificial trans fats. But you will see on a lot of foods, they'll advertise no trans fats because, again, it's pretty widely accepted that these are so bad for us that a lot of companies, even if their food naturally did not have a trans fat in it to begin with, they will advertise on the packaging no trans fats, just because they know that most people accept that that's a good thing, that we don't want foods with trans fats in them. So you learned something new today about that. Now, compound lipids are important too. Everything we just talked about, the fatty acids, or the triglycerides rather, are simple compounds. Simple lipids. And now we need to talk about the other class, which is the compound lipids. And compound lipids play an important role in the cell membrane, as we said. So the phospholipid bilayer, which we talked about briefly way earlier in the year when we studied cells. And you will see that phospholipid bilayer again and again and again in science until you graduate. But cholesterol is an example of a compound lipid. And I know you've heard of cholesterol before. Cholesterol is a vital part of all cell membranes. It's also a vital part of your brain, and of many other important things in your body. And much like fats in general, as we just talked about, cholesterol also gets a really bad rap, specifically when we talk about heart disease. Okay, you've heard of people who get heart disease or have heart attacks and clogged arteries and stuff. So cholesterol kind of takes the brunt of that hatred towards it. But again, science is always changing, and current research is actually showing that a high cholesterol diet does not necessarily lead to heart disease. Instead, there's a bunch of other things we have to look at. We can't just point the finger at cholesterol anymore. Instead, dietary factors. So what else are you eating? Are you eating a bunch of junk food and sugar that's loaded with cholesterol, or are you eating a really healthy diet that also has cholesterol? How you live your life. Are you active or are you very sedentary, which means to be very inactive or sit a lot? Genetics. Your genetics play a vital role in how your body operates. So maybe you have a genetic predisposition to high or low cholesterol or heart disease. So all of these things now we need to really take into consideration. We can't just point the finger at cholesterol and give it a bad rap, because we need it. And in fact, they're learning now that cholesterol may actually be protective against a lot of the neurodegenerative conditions that we see or hear about today, like Alzheimer's, dementia, or Parkinson's. All of those have to do with your brain, or in the nervous system. And as I just said a minute ago, cholesterol plays an important role in your brain. So it would make sense that maybe we actually do need a lot of cholesterol to take care of our brain throughout our lifetime to prevent some of these really unfortunate conditions that seem to be on the rise lately. And there's actually some debate out there. If you look at some of the research, when we started to see Alzheimer's and dementia specifically, both of these kind of increasing in cases, if you look at the history and the trends, that's right around the time that a lot of the nutrition advice that was circulating in the 70s and 80s and such was saying not to eat fat. And so as we started to tell people to eat less fat because it was bad and therefore less cholesterol, we started to see a bigger increase in these diseases. So that's what a lot of scientists are looking at right now is, did we get it wrong? Do we actually need a lot of healthy fats and cholesterol in the right amounts to nourish our brain and prevent these things? So just very interesting. It's at least interesting to me, but if not to you, it should be, because we're all in some way, shape, or form at risk of these types of illnesses as we age, and taking care of our bodies now is a good way to help prevent those things in the future. So again, taking a look at the nutrition facts label for fat, you can see here we've got a lot more categories that fall under fat. So we did the total fat, but there's also indented here, we have saturated fat and trans fat, and sometimes you'll also see unsaturated fat listed here as well. And so the total fat here is usually taking into consideration what's under here. Again, it's a rough estimate. They're not, certain laws don't require nutrition facts labels to include everything. So there very well could be some unsaturated fat in here that makes up the total fat. But generally speaking, you should be able to add trans fat, saturated fat, and whatever other types of fats should add up to roughly the total fat under here. And we also see cholesterol on the nutrition facts label. So in this case, this particular food provides 55 milligrams of cholesterol. Another thing pertaining to fat that you will sometimes find on a nutrition facts label is the calories from fat section. So again, this this goes hand in hand with that fat gets a bad rap. This got added to the nutrition facts label at the time that Americans specifically were told not to eat any fat. It was bad for you. You have to eat low fat. And so when all those low-fat foods came out, they started adding this to the food label so that people knew exactly how many of the 200 calories in this food came from a fat source. So of the 200 calories, 130 of those came from fat in this food. And so how did they get that? Well, you guys know 1 gram of fat is 9 kcals. So they take all of the fats and calculate. And again, it comes close. It's not an exact number because, again, there's all those laws that allow them some leeway with how they label their food. But it's a close estimate as to how many calories actually come from fat. All right, and so I just want to close out with talking about kind of a current trend right now. I think it's important for you guys to know what's out there in culture right now, what society is saying, and historically in America, we go through these different trends with different diets throughout different years. Like one year, this diet's really big, and then that diet's really big, and that diet's really big. Currently, keto is really big, and keto directly relates to our study of lipids today because keto is a high-fat diet, and you've probably heard of this. I would be really surprised if you've never heard of this, given kind of everything that's out there right now. But if you haven't, then keto stands for the ketogenic diet. And this is the kind of food pyramid for the ketogenic diet. It emphasizes high-fat foods and low-carb foods. And it avoids things like grains, wheat, corn, rice, cereal, sugars, because sugars are not low-carb. It eliminates fruit because most fruit, other than the berries, have a lot of carbs and sugar in them, and no starchy vegetables. So they eat a lot of low-carb veggies like broccoli and green beans and spinach, and high-fat foods like butter, avocados, cheese, milk, and fatty cuts of meat. And so this is the current trend. And so basically the idea behind the keto diet is that you go from burning sugar or glucose in your body to burning fat. And so you actually change the way your body metabolizes energy or how it utilizes energy in the body. And so normally we know and we learned that glucose is your main fuel source. It's what your brain likes. It's what's circulating in your blood right now as you speak. Okay? However, if you were to stop eating carbs or get down to a low enough amount of carbs that you're not taking in that sugar and that glucose, your body has to have another means to supply energy. And that comes in the form of something called ketone bodies, which is where the term keto or ketogenic comes from. So your body can actually, in a pinch, say, wait a minute, we're going to turn off sugar burning and we're going to turn on fat burning. And it uses the fat that you eat in this high-fat diet as well as your body fat that you may have to produce these ketones to provide your body with the fuel that it needs so it can keep working even though you're not taking in glucose. All right, and I am in no way, shape, or form endorsing the ketogenic diet for anyone here. I just think it's important, as I said, for you to be knowledgeable and aware of some of the things that are floating around on the news and in social media and such, and kind of the buzzwords that we're hearing right now and having an understanding of what that is. And so, as I just said, this chart is kind of explaining what it means to be in ketosis, which is the state in which your body is now burning those ketone bodies. So it takes a little bit to get into ketosis, but after a couple days of low carb, high fat food, you will find yourself in ketosis. And so in a traditional diet, which is considered high in carbs, after you eat, your glucose levels rise, your pancreas, as we talked about, secretes insulin to respond to the glucose, and insulin allows that glucose to move into your cells, and you get energy for your cells from the glucose. In the ketogenic diet, which is high fat instead of high carb, your glucose levels fall as you stop eating carbs and you eat more fattening foods. And the enzyme lipase releases those triglycerides that we just studied into your body. And those fatty acids travel to the liver where they help your liver to produce those ketones, which now give you energy. So we're using ketones as energy here versus glucose as energy here. Okay? So for homework, you're going to do a little bit more diving into the keto world. And what you're going to do is you're going to watch the short linked video that I have below. It's just a clip from the Dr. Oz show, in which a couple physicians are talking about what the ketogenic diet looks like and kind of what they do. And then I actually want you to research when and why the ketogenic diet was discovered. My hint here is that it was not actually for weight loss. And you're going to write a 1-paragraph explanation of your research. So just explain to me in 6 to 8 sentences when and why the ketogenic diet was started. Now, I said that ketogenic diet is kind of the buzzword, the current trend. It's the 2019, 2020, maybe even 2021 buzz diet that's floating around. But it actually has its roots way back, like way back. So it's a lot older than you would think, based off current trends. And again, its reason for development has nothing to do with weight loss. So it was not developed as a weight loss diet. So I want you to tell me why that is. What did it get developed for? Because it's pretty fascinating, and I will say that the reason that it was developed is still used today in hospitals. It's still widely used because it does work, and it's very effective for a lot of patients. All right, and so that is your only homework. Email me that paragraph when you're done. I'm excited to read what you find. And with that, you just have one more video lesson on Friday, and I will see you then.